Imagine receiving a phone call that destroys everything you have come to accept about your life. Not a call with bad news. Worse than that. A call with good news. The kind that arrives after years of silence and grief and slow resignation. The kind you stopped believing would ever come. Your missing child. Found. Alive. Somewhere in Spain. Now imagine answering that call and realizing, slowly, over days and weeks, that the person on the other end is not your child at all. That you know this. That you can see it with your own eyes. That the shape of the face is wrong, the accent is wrong, the eyes are the wrong color, and yet something inside you, something older and more desperate than reason, reaches toward this stranger with open arms and calls him family. This is not a story about a con man. It is a story about grief, and what grief is willing to believe. It is a story about a boy who vanished without explanation, a family fractured by silence, and a man who had spent his entire life becoming other people, until he became someone else's dead son. And the most disturbing question this case leaves behind is not how Frédéric Bourdin fooled the world. It is why the people who loved Nicholas Barclay helped him do it. San Antonio, Texas, June 13th, 1994. A warm evening in a working-class neighborhood. Nicholas Barclay was 13 years old. He had blue eyes, blonde hair, and a small tattoo. Unusual for a boy his age, but Nicholas was not a typical child. He was restless, troubled, in the way that teenagers from unstable households often are. He fought at school, struggled at home. His mother, Beverly, was raising him largely alone. The family structure was fragmented. The home was strained. Nicholas moved through the world with a particular kind of energy that adults often mislabel as defiance, but is usually something closer to unprocessed pain. That evening, he went to play basketball with friends at a neighborhood court. He didn't come home. At first, his family assumed he had simply stayed out late. It happened. Nicholas was not always where he was supposed to be, but the hours stretched into morning, and then into days, and Nicholas Barclay did not return. No sightings, no credible leads, no explanation. What the police found, and what would quietly haunt investigators for years, was a pattern of inconsistencies around the disappearance. The lead detective noted that Nicholas had reportedly called home the night he vanished, asking for a ride, and that no one came to get him. The details of who was home that night, what was said, and what was done next would shift subtly depending on who was asked and when. Nothing rose to the level of proof. But nothing was fully resolved either. Nicholas Barclay entered the official record as a missing child. His file was eventually transferred to a cold case unit. His family grieved in the fragmented, disorganized way that families with limited resources often grieve, without counseling, without closure, without answers. His mother, by various accounts, entered a period of deep dysfunction. His older sister, Carrie, carried the wound in a different way, quietly, outwardly, the kind of grief that calcifies rather than dissolves. 3.5 years passed. Then the phone rang. It was October 1997. The call came from Spain. A young American boy had been found by Spanish authorities in the city of Linares. He was confused, distressed, and claiming to have been the victim of a trafficking network. He said his name was Nicholas Barclay. He said he was 16 years old. He said he had escaped from a life too terrible to fully describe. For Beverly Barclay and her family, this was impossible and yet undeniable. Nicholas, found in Spain. After 3 years of silence, 3 years of not knowing whether he was alive or buried in an unmarked place somewhere in Texas, their son had surfaced. Carrie flew to Spain to bring him home. She walked into a room in a children's shelter and looked at the boy. Even in the immediate testimony of those involved, What happened in that moment is difficult to reconstruct with confidence. What we know is that Carey identified him as her brother and brought him back to San Antonio. What we do not fully know, what remains the central psychological mystery of this case, is what she actually saw when she looked at that boy's face. Because the boy in that room was not Nicholas Barclay. He was Frédéric Bourdin. He was 23 years old. He was French. His eyes were brown, not blue. His hair was dark. His accent, when he spoke English, carried the unmistakable trace of a non-native speaker. He had covered his eyes with dark-tinted contact lenses. He had dyed his hair. He had memorized what details he could find about Nicholas Barclay from official missing child databases. He had fabricated a story of abduction and abuse so extreme that it seemed to explain away every physical discrepancy in advance. The agencies that held him, he claimed, had altered his appearance, done things to him. That was why he seemed different. That was why his eyes had changed. Frédéric Bourdin had been doing this for years. He was born in 1974 in France, the illegitimate child of a relationship his mother largely abandoned. Bourdin would later describe a childhood of radical instability, passed between relatives, ignored, unwanted, a child who existed at the edges of other people's families without ever belonging to one. The psychological interpretation that both he and others have offered is almost too on the nose. A boy who felt invisible learned to become invisible in a different way. He learned to become other people. His first known impersonation occurred when he was around 18. He posed as a minor in order to gain access to youth shelters, care systems, and the institutional warmth that came with being a lost child. He was not trying to steal money. He was not running a financial con. He wanted what the shelters provided: warmth, attention, identity, belonging. He would arrive with a false name and a rehearsed story, and for a time, institutions would treat him as a child in need. When he was eventually exposed, he would disappear and begin again somewhere else. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Bourdin had assumed at least a dozen false identities across multiple countries. He became, in a sense, a professional ghost, a man with no stable self who inhabited other people's stories for shelter. Spanish authorities who encountered him in late 1997 initially had no idea who he was. He had presented himself as a disturbed minor, initially without a name. It was Bourdin himself who, while searching the database of missing American children, found Nicholas Barclay and saw an opportunity. The details he gathered were thin: a name, an age, a physical description, a location, the Barclay family's contact information, and a timeline of absence that Bourdin understood intuitively. A family that had not seen their child in 3 years was a family whose grief was extensive enough to overwhelm careful scrutiny. He was right. What followed Nicholas Barclay's supposed return to San Antonio is one of the most psychologically complex episodes in the modern literature of deception. Bourdin moved into the family home. He was introduced to neighbors, to friends, to extended family members. He attended counseling sessions designed to help Nicholas readjust to life after trauma. He was enrolled, briefly, in school. Photographs were taken. He was called Nicholas. He called Beverly Mom. And for roughly 5 months, this continued. The inconsistencies were present from the beginning, and they were not subtle. Bourdin spoke English with a French accent, which he explained by claiming that the people who had held him had spoken primarily in another language. His eyes were brown. He explained that his captors had injected substances into his eyes that had altered his pigmentation, a claim with no medical basis. His hair was darker. His facial structure, to those who looked closely, was simply different. Broader jaw, different proportions, older features. At the time of his supposed return, Nicholas Barclay would have been 16. Bourdin was 23. The age difference, for those willing to see it, was visible. Multiple people in Nicholas's social orbit reportedly felt uneasy. Former friends who had known Nicholas as a child noted that the person in the house did not behave like him, did not remember things he should have remembered, did not carry himself with the familiar energy of the boy they had known. Some stayed silent. Some expressed quiet doubts. Nobody acted. This is where the case becomes genuinely disturbing in a way that goes beyond Bourdin himself. The FBI would eventually become involved after a private investigator named Charlie Parker, hired by a television journalist, not by the family, began examining the case independently. Parker was a former law enforcement officer with experience in document fraud. He looked at Bourdin's ears. In forensic identification, the ear is considered one of the most individually distinctive features of the human face. Parker looked at photographs of Nicholas Barclay and looked at the young man living in the Barclay home and concluded, with professional certainty, that they were not the same person. When FBI agents subsequently obtained DNA and fingerprint samples, the confirmation was immediate and absolute. The person living with the Barclay family was not Nicholas Barclay. He was Frédéric Bourdin. Bourdin was arrested in January 1998. He was charged with passport fraud and making false statements to federal officials. He eventually served approximately 6 years in custody between the United States and France. He has never stopped impersonating people. Bourdin's arrest did not resolve the case. It deepened it. Because once Bourdin was removed from the house, the question that remained was not only how he had deceived the authorities, or how he had navigated the institutional machinery of identity documentation. The question was about the family. Specifically, what did they know, and when did they know it? FBI investigators, by multiple accounts, emerged from their interrogations deeply unsatisfied. Not necessarily because they believed the family had committed a crime, but because the family's behavior defied the logic of innocent acceptance. Most parents, confronted with a child who looked different, sounded different, had different eyes, a different build, a foreign accent, most parents would refuse, would insist on tests, would call a doctor, demand an explanation, resist the implausible story. The Barclays had done something different. They had accepted. One investigative theory, never proven, never formally charged, but circulated seriously enough to appear in multiple journalistic accounts of the case, was that the family, or at least some members of it, knew that Nicholas was almost certainly dead. That in accepting Bourdin, they were not acting out of delusion. They were acting out of something more calculated, a desire to avoid the scrutiny that a renewed investigation into Nicholas's original disappearance might bring. If Nicholas had returned, there was no need to dig up old questions about the night he vanished, about who was home, about what had or had not been done. Bourdin himself, and here one must be careful, because Bourdin is an extraordinarily unreliable narrator with extensive motivation to rewrite events in his own favor, has said that Carrie, Nicholas's sister, seemed to know he was not her brother, that the warmth she showed him was not the warmth of genuine belief, that there was a kind of mutual performance happening, a conspiracy of silence in which everyone understood the fiction and agreed to sustain it. This is unverified. Kerry Gibson has denied it. Beverly Barclay has not spoken extensively on the subject in publicly documented interviews. The FBI closed the investigation into the family without charges. But the question has never entirely gone away. What does it feel like to lose a child and never know why? This is not an abstract question. It is the emotional foundation upon which everything in this case rests. The grief of families in missing child cases is a specific and brutal kind. It lacks the finality that, however terrible, allows people to eventually begin rebuilding. The Barclay family spent 3.5 years in that suspended state. The years of not knowing that are, by many accounts, more psychologically corrosive than the knowledge of death. You cannot mourn what you cannot confirm. You cannot close a door that will not close. And then the phone call comes. Your child is alive. In Spain. He has been through something unimaginable. He needs you. Even if, and we must sit with this, even if somewhere beneath the relief and the tears and the impossible hope, a quiet voice is saying that something is wrong, that the boy on the phone does not sound quite right, that the boy walking toward you in the Spanish shelter is not the boy you lost. What do you do with that voice? What kind of cruelty does it take to silence a hope that large? Bourdin gave them something they needed more than accuracy. He gave them an ending. The human capacity for motivated belief, the psychological phenomenon of seeing what we need to see when the alternative is unbearable, is well documented in clinical literature. It is not weakness. It is not stupidity. It is a survival mechanism. Families of missing children have accepted false returners before and since. The psychological literature on the subject consistently identifies the same pattern. The need to believe overrides the evidence that contradicts the belief, and the mind constructs elaborate supporting structures to keep the belief intact. Whether that psychology alone explains what happened in the Barclay house, or whether there was something darker operating alongside it, is a question this case cannot fully answer. Nicholas Barclay's case remains officially unsolved. He has never been found. No body, no confirmed location, no named suspect. The original investigation generated theories about individuals in Nicholas's orbit, about the neighborhood, about the fragmented details of the night he disappeared, but nothing that produced an arrest or a charge. The case is cold in the truest sense. Not abandoned, but frozen. Frédéric Bourdin was deported after serving his sentence and returned to Europe. He was subsequently convicted of impersonating a minor in France and sentenced to additional prison time. He married, had children, gave interviews. In some of those interviews, he expressed something that sounded like remorse. In others, something that sounded like pride. He is a man who has spent his entire adult life in a kind of performative relationship with identity itself, and it is genuinely difficult to know where the performance ends. In a 2012 documentary about the case, also titled The Impostor, Bourdin spoke at length about his motivations, his psychology, his understanding of why the family accepted him. The documentary is a remarkable artifact in part because Bourdin is clearly still performing within it. Self-aware, theatrical, shaping his own narrative even as he appears to confess. He is not a simple villain. He is not a sympathetic figure either. He is something more uncomfortable, a man whose deep pathology intersected with another family's deep wound in a way that allowed both to sustain a shared fiction for 5 months. What the documentary could not fully resolve, what no account of this case has fully resolved, is the central absence at its heart. Nicholas Barclay, a 13-year-old boy who went to play basketball one evening in June 1994 and never came home, whose file sits in a cold case database somewhere in Texas, whose face appears on the old missing child flyers in the way that the faces of all missing children appear, open, ordinary, unknowing, looking out at a world that has not yet failed them. We are unsettled by con men and imposters because they exploit something we would prefer to believe is not exploitable. The idea that identity is fixed, that we know our own children, that grief is too sacred to be weaponized. Bourdin demonstrated, in the most visceral way possible, that none of those things are guaranteed. But the deeper discomfort of this case is not about Bourdin at all. It is about a family that looked at a stranger, a man with the wrong eyes, the wrong voice, the wrong face, and opened the door. Whatever was happening inside that house in San Antonio in the months between October 1997 and January 1998, it was not simply gullibility. It was something more human and more troubling than that. It was a choice, conscious or unconscious, to need the story to be true more than they needed the story to be accurate. And the most haunting thing about that choice is how thoroughly understandable it is. We all believe things we need to believe. We all construct versions of the world that protect us from the unbearable alternatives. Most of us simply never encounter a Frédéric Bourdin, someone skilled enough and desperate enough to find the exact shape of our need and fill it. Nicholas Barclay was 13 years old. He had blue eyes. He never came home. Whatever happened to him is still out there somewhere, unanswered, in the dark. And perhaps that is the most disturbing truth of all. Not that an impostor fooled a family, but that a boy's disappearance was so thoroughly eclipsed by the spectacle of the deception that came after it, that the question of what happened to Nicholas Barclay became, somehow, the secondary story. His absence remains absolute, unexplained, waiting.